Now what you are all here for, I'd like to introduce you all to our presenters today. Jody Deming is a professor in oceanography who, with her research group, explores microbial life in the Arctic Ocean and its sea ice cover, including adaptation to the cold and broader ecological roles. Daniel Kohn is a Franco-American figurative painter immersed in questions of place and representation, whose work stands at the crossroad of art and science. Thank you both so much for joining us today, and with that, I'll stop sharing my screen and let Jody and Daniel take it away.
Can you see my screen?
Looks good, thank you.
Great. Thank you, and thank you for the invitation to present about our project today. Daniel and I are very happy to be here and are hopeful for a relaxed exchange here over ocean memory. The Ocean Memory Project has its own website. You can visit us at any time. We are supported by the National Academy's Keck Futures Initiative, and our primary being is that we are a collective network of researchers from across all walks of life, sciences, arts, humanities. We are specifically dedicated to exploring the intersection between the ocean and memory, and to advance this intersection as a new field of scholarship and creative expression. The juxtaposition of those two words, ocean and memory, is very important to how we came to be and where we are headed. As humans have memory, we are suggesting that the ocean and systems in the ocean also have memory, which gives us an immediate, intimate connection with this vast ocean, since we can all relate to memory. We started with a small grant that had some very specific aims, and we've been working away at these. I'd like to indicate a few points from these in a short presentation here. But our first goal has been to build a community of collaborators. And here is a diagram that you're not expected to read, but to get the sense of our community as it has developed, the flow of it and the interactiveness of it. I'm sure Daniel can speak to this further. We held our first workshop right here in home territory on Friday Harbor Laboratories a couple of years ago. And our first order of business was to design an interactive space, because we were bringing together people who normally do not come together and are not accustomed to what you see here in the Commons Hall at Friday Harbor, which is the hierarchical setup of the instructor with the classroom. And Daniel immediately switched us around to a circle where everyone is on an equal footing and facing each other for a discussion. And we kept that arrangement very productively ever since. We also had to learn to design our thinking together. And initially we had some facilitators to help us with this ideation process, the development of ideas between disciplines and practices. And we learned how to use our hands to make things, to express the ideas we were coming up with. This is kind of new for scientists, not so new for artists, but it was a very mind-opening way of experiencing a new idea. This event depicted here is the entire origin of the universe, right there in Commons Hall. We also used the vessel, the Centennial, no longer with us, unfortunately, to put artists and scientists together at sea and experience how science works, but also experience how art works. And we began to play with conceptual ideas and analogies between the human brain and how it encodes, stores, and recalls memories to build towards a better future, and the ocean brain, how its microbial agents might be doing a similar thing in their interactive networks. This is just one of boundless forms of memory in the ocean, but it's one that we started with. And we pursued this idea and others at another workshop, at this time at an artist retreat south of San Francisco, with a spectacular space to think and be. And we have explored ideas further here. We have some hard and fast outcomes. Rebecca Rutstein, working with Mandy Joy, has now a permanent sculptural installation at the Georgia Museum of Art, which depicts microbial networks that are bioluminescing in the deep ocean. We have people exploring concepts of sound in the ocean, since sound is a very unique way, unique to human beings anyway, not unique to those that live in the ocean, a unique way of encoding information. And so there's an exploration ongoing of how that may work. And there are more classic, I would say, interactions between artists and scientists, where the artists are working to depict science in a way that is appealing and graspable to anyone. We then applied for and received a larger award from NACFE called the Challenge Award, where we would have a number of years. We have 4 years to explore this concept of ocean memory. And we had a plan with 4 large in-person conferences that we would host, so as to deeply explore different aspects of ocean memory. You see, cognition and genomics was the first, senses and sensing, pollution, forgetting, and memory loss is a very important part of ocean memory, with a final conference that we had envisioned having here, and maybe we still will. But we started with a research cruise on the Rachel Carson, our wonderful new vessel, here in the Salish Sea, working with some members of tribal nations, and also with our whole collection of, or members of our community. You see people, we turned the ship engines off entirely. The crew were so accommodating to us, so as to listen to memories in the water itself. And we also demonstrated life in the ocean and how it may be interacting and forming memories as we looked at them. And we had artists on board painting in real time. We had expected to have an art exhibit in the School of Oceanography, an art science exhibit as a result of this, and we still hope to, but then came COVID. So we, like everyone, have had to adjust. We've had to re-envision how we would go forward with this exploration at this intersection. And so we turned our first workshop into a virtual workshop on genomics and cognition. And this has led to 5 ongoing art science awards we could talk about if you wish. We initiated the pandemic discussions, as we call them, and they led to this Scientific American article, "The Ocean Carries Memories of SARS-CoV-2." What we did in exploring with each other across disciplines was to come to a realization that the ancient lineage of the coronavirus comes from the ocean. And there is much to learn from the ocean about even what we're experiencing with the pandemic at the human level. We also instigated the story circle, which is an indigenous form of ideation that has proved very intimate and powerful, and one that I see as continuing forward for a long time. And we initiated a webinar series. We've had 2 so far, and they're available on our website if you wish to explore them. And I'm going to stop there and just let you know that we are also interested in your ideas, and here are some ways to contact us. And Daniel has a few things to say that are extremely important about how we interact.
So hi, everybody. Wonderful to see you all here, although I don't see most of you, but to know that you're here. So yeah, I wanted to touch a little bit on the community aspect of our work. And I think what was particular for us was that from the beginning, it was both a collaborative research effort and a community effort. And we care very much about the ways in which we interact with each other, the ways we listen to each other. And I think from the beginning, we've been looking at ways to create spaces in between each of us. Frequently in art science collaborations, artists go and find scientists they want to work with, and the scientists talk about their work, and then the artists go back to their studio and make something with it. And it tends to be very science focused and artist led. And from the beginning of this, what was fantastic is that it was really a meeting of a very diverse group of people, looking to learn from each other and to develop something that existed between us rather than in any of our realms. And so there's been a lot of exchange of practices, exchange of points of view, exchange of ways of collecting knowledge and of transmitting it. So the question of points of view, I think maybe just I want to close with that, but for us, so in our culture at the moment, there's a lot of attention paid to diversity. And in the general culture, it sometimes is an intention that's not necessarily connected to the core of what people do. And I think for us from the very beginning, our premise is that in the contemporary world, we understand it through a multiplicity of gazes, that the world doesn't just exist in isolation and then we all see it, but the world is what we see. And so every new person, every new point of view we can bring to our table helps us better see the world we're looking at, helps us better understand what ocean memory might be. And so from the beginning, ocean memory has not been one thing for us. It's every facet, every way of looking at it that our participants might have. And so we're very interested in adding to our group and adding points of view that are very different than ours. Up until now, it's been a fairly, I would say, so contemporary Western science and Western art both tend to have a kind of universalist way of looking at the world, where we try and apply our truths across the space and time that we occupy. And so they tend to be, in some ways, for example, if you imagine as a painter, I make a painting and then it's supposed to be able to be seen in any single gallery in the world. It's supposed to fit anywhere. And during the cruise we did in the Salish Sea and the Puget Sound, we had meetings with First Nation members who came on board and showed us their land and waters and talked to us about their culture. And I think what was really eye-opening was how much a located point of view changes the way you look at anything. And so in their way of talking about their cosmogony, all the parts were connected to each other. And whereas in our cultures, we tend to think of art and science and politics and culture and religion as separate, in the communications we had and the stories we heard, there was very much a sense of integration of those elements. And so we're really interested in that sense of location, and we're kind of thinking about moving our group to a phase where we're starting these ocean memory nodes, where we'd like to create groups or bring together groups of people thinking about ocean memory around geographic locations with the human relationships that exist there, the economic relationships, the concerns about the environment, of the specifics of the environment, and see how those local collective explorations then inform this larger effort. So this idea of really connecting the local to the global in a feedback. So I think that's all I wanted to say for now. We are curious about starting an ocean memory node in the Pacific Northwest. We kind of imagine something that would connect people across the US-Canadian border, that would involve University of Washington, perhaps University of Victoria, or other academic institutions in the area. So we're also curious, since you, presumably most of you are here, if you are interested in ocean memory and would like to help us think through what a local instance of ocean memory would look like, we'd love to hear from you. So that's it for now for me.
Awesome. Thank you both so much. This is really inspiring to me personally as someone who has a deep connection to the ocean. And so this gives me a lot to think about. So our panel discussion is next. And folks in our audience, please ask your questions in the chat. We have somebody on the line who is going to tally the questions for the Q&A portion at the end of this panel. So ask your questions away and we'll get started on the panel. So we like to ask each group about the same questions each time so we can learn about the similarities and the differences between these kinds of collaborations. And we always like to begin at the beginning. So collaborating, especially with someone from a different field or discipline, can be risky and time consuming. And Daniel and Jody, you both did touch on this, but I'd love for you to dive into a little deeper. What were the factors that made you feel that this would be worthwhile? And did you have any doubts before you started?
Shall I jump in there, or do you want to go first, Daniel?
No, please.
I certainly had doubts. I even had to have my arm twisted to go to the very first meeting that was going to be of artists and scientists. I was very focused on my science, on what my group was doing, on the next project. I was very focused, and this was going to be a drain. But I went, and when those two words, ocean and memory, got put together, and Daniel was the one who put them together in the midst of a little workshop we were having at this first conference, I literally jumped off my seat and said, that's it. Because what washed over me was that everything I'd been doing in my science career was about memory in the ocean. And memory is not just history of what has happened in the ocean. We have a word for that, paleo-oceanography. But memory is about the use of all that encoded information so as to be better fit if you're an organism going forward, be better fit if you're an ecosystem going forward, or even if you're an eddy, a form of water in the ocean. Those are predicted better if we take into account their memory. So everything that I had been working about, just thought, oh, ocean memory, yes. And so having that connection and that subject matter, which was a new way to view everything I'd been doing, but still resonated so strongly, that relaxed me. Okay, I'm gonna see where this goes. I wanna see what can be done with this. So it was as much the subject matter as anything that relaxed me of my type A scientist mode.
I'm in New York, right next to a subway line, so I have to mute myself every so often if you don't want to be deluged with New Yorkness. Yeah, so for me it's mixed. I'm someone who carries a lot of doubt, but I think one of the particularities of an artistic practice is the license to dream and to carry visions. And I think we're trained to do that. So we imagine possible futures. And in order to be able to carry a vision, you kind of have to suspend doubt. And so you have to be able to stand up in front of your peers and say, this is what I see, and do you want to share it with me? And so I think for me, in a sort of paradoxical way, there is no doubt in that space. And I think that's one of the things that artists can bring to other disciplines is this practice of vision making. Obviously, we're not the only ones who do that, but we do have experience with it, and it's something we can share. And what's been particularly touching and profound about this group of collaborators is that from the beginning, we were a multiple. You know, it wasn't just Jody and I. The first grant we wrote together, we were 5. So we were 5 co-leaders. And after we organized the first workshop, we had some really good criticism from participants. So we asked them to organize the next one. And so there's been this kind of intentional sharing of this collective, what is in effect now a collective dream, and a reality. But so in those moments, I mean, in the fact that there is this relay, there isn't, you can have doubt and step back and someone else will pick up the ball and move forward with it. And it's been really, really generous in that way. Really, really gratifying.
Love that. I love the idea of having folks plan the next one if they didn't like the first one. I'll keep that in mind for some of my work too. So what are the key things you did that enabled your collaboration to be successful? Jody, you talked a little bit about some of the processes that you had to get everyone on the same page, but for you personally, each of you, did it take a shift in attitude, different ways of socializing, or a certain meeting structure? What did you find helped you be successful in your collaboration?
For me, it was learning a new way to interact, where everyone is equal at the table. And actually Zoom has helped that too, because there's a sort of equity about the way we appear together on screen. It's different than in person where you can set up and feel hierarchies and that sort of thing. But having a different way of interacting where we do as much or more listening as we do speaking has been very important for me. Yeah, so I had to learn a new way of listening and interacting.
Yeah, I think for me, what's been the deepest learning is learning to step back and be quiet and listen. And to, as a leader of a group or as a co-leader of a group, to learn kind of to lead from behind and to, yeah, not take the front stage, and to find ways in which that those roles can be shared increasingly as the group matures. And that's as Jody said with Zoom, it's been really interesting because with Zoom and the pandemic, I think all of us being under a lot of stress and a lot of isolation has required that we develop a space of care. And so often research spaces are somewhat competitive, and this collective is not competitive. It's not based on who can get the most time, who can put their ideas forward the most. It's really based on how do you circulate speech and how do you build ideas collectively. So the pandemic article that was published in Scientific American was published, we were 11 authors, and we're all authors. It wasn't like there was one author and 10 signers. We all worked together on a Google document on 3 or 4 as they kind of evolved. And so we really developed that practice of collective authorship, collective thinking. And it doesn't mean that all of the ideas are shared. And in fact, individuals bring sort of priceless gems, points of view, new ideas to the table. So for example, Kathy Foley-Meyer, who joined our group in June, found us because she was doing her thesis on what has happened to the bodies of, what is the memory of the slaves who were thrown overboard during the Middle Passage. And so our group's now embracing and struggling through or thinking through that space. And it wasn't, I mean, it was something we had thought about before, but it wasn't something that we had entered yet. And so we wouldn't be here thinking about that if Kathy hadn't brought it, at least not yet. And so, yeah, it's just really important how that integration or connection between the collective and caring for the collective, and then caring and listening to those individual voices is to me what collaboration is about.
Thank you. On the flip side, so we asked what were the key things that helped you be successful. What was the most difficult for you? Were there any points where you felt like just giving up, throwing in the towel? And then if so, what enabled you to move past that point?
Yes, I thought about throwing in the towel many times, but not the ocean memory towel. I had too many things on my docket, and I still have too many things on my docket. And I would like to throw the towel in on something so that I can focus more on the things that are most meaningful. I haven't figured that out yet, but I never wanted to throw in the towel on ocean memory. Too powerful for me.
No. I've really reorganized my life to, I mean, I've sort of stepped back in my artistic practice. For 10 years, I collaborated with a genome research center called the Broad Institute in Cambridge. And in the second year there, I put together with somebody else a science visualization group. And one of our members was this guy, Luis, who's an older Media Lab student. And one day I was like, Luis, I don't know what I'm doing with these people. And I said, Daniel, you're just painting with people. And in some ways, my practice has kind of shifted from a solo studio practice to this collective kind of listening, supporting, paying attention, guiding, dreaming. And so I've kind of pared down a lot of other things in order for this to exist. And I think in different ways, that's what's happening with other people in the group, where it's kind of becoming more and more at the center of our lives. So at least.
Sounds like you're on the same page. Sometimes we get folks who are like, well, this is the first time I've told you this, but yes, I wanted to quit last week. But it sounds like this is a really special program for both of you, and which makes me happy to see what happens next. So this is actually a great segue. We'd like to explore, how has this collaboration changed you? So has it changed or perceived your field, or has it changed how you perceive your collaborators' field, or has anything surprised you? So something to explore there.
I always go first here. I'll just touch on one thing here that Daniel's already alluded to. When Kathy Foley-Meyer came into our group, the African-American artist in LA who is studying the Middle Passage and how to think about the fate of her ancestors who didn't make it to the Americas. And this is not a subject I've ever read about or thought deeply about, but we were asked to give a joint webinar together. And so I spent time with Kathy on several Zoom exchanges where she was the teacher and I was the listener. But what came out of this was that I realized that the first 20 years of my career, when I was working in the Atlantic Ocean, I was studying the recycling processes that happen at the seafloor, at the interface between the ocean and the seabed, at all the sites along that defined the slave trade. And so for me, it was a huge awakening and revisiting of 20 years of publications and research on the fate of organic matter in the ocean, and thinking about, in Kathy's words, how the Atlantic Ocean may be memorializing Blackness or memorializing the loss of 4 million Africans who never made it to the Americas. And this was mind expanding for me and caused me to reevaluate a lot of work that I had done, think about it in a new way, in a very, very disturbing to delve into it, but also very rewarding to realize that the ocean does memorialize organic matter, whether it's human or not. And we are all a part of the vital cycles of the ocean.
I think maybe I answered already your question, how it's changed me, but definitely something I learned, I think. And just, so I'm not someone who likes to perform. I'd rather not be on stage. And we two of our members started, as Jody mentioned, started a story circle. And the process is everybody gets 2 minutes. It's unprepared. A topic gets thrown in, and someone starts, and then someone follows, and you can pass. And I had assumed that I would pass because I don't like telling stories, and especially not stories that are personal. You're supposed to tell things that are your own stories, and I don't like improvising that in that way. But the person before me, who's from New Orleans, from a white New Orleans family, started talking about the fact that her family came from Haiti, and started talking about this travel across water. And I realized that my story travels across water. I was born in India. When I moved to France, my parents are French American, and I often describe myself as mid-Atlantic in a very literal sense, kind of stuck in this body of water between land masses. And so the story just came out like immediately. And that process is really, really powerful in how it connects personal narrative to an ideation process. And the last part of that is quite beautiful, is that as part of the instructions, we are told that silence is sacred. And if someone ends their story before their 2 minutes are up, the rest of the time is spent in silence. And there's something quite beautiful about a group of people on Zoom or elsewhere spending some time together in silence, and something happens there that's again quite profound, and not about like needing to fill the space or be afraid of the emptiness that might happen. So that's taught me a lot. I'd love to hear about who is listening, and maybe some of their thoughts or their questions, and maybe what ocean memory evokes to them.
Yeah, that would be great. If folks wanted to share your stories in the chat, or if you don't mind speaking, we could have you sign a UW waiver so we can share it online.
So our meetings are usually very different than this. We usually have everybody visible and unmuted, and we would have normally taken some time at the beginning of the meeting for everybody to be able to do a check-in and tell us where they are, what's happening in their lives, and what they're thinking. So maybe at another time we can we can revisit this and kind of see what, I mean, I'm very curious about what your community is and what you can bring to us.
That's great. We do have some questions for you, which we can get started on if folks want to start sharing your ocean memory thoughts in the chat while we ask some questions, and we can highlight some that if you want to share. So we do have some questions here. Folks are curious about, we have one specifically for you, Daniel. Jody mentioned that you proposed the idea of ocean memory. Could you speak to how the term came to you and what it means to you? Maybe that could help jog people's ideas for what it means to them.
I think a lot about negative space. I like thinking about, you know, as painters, we're trained in thinking about positive and negative space, the space between things, the space that frames things. It's often the space that you don't talk about. So, you know, if you draw a still life, you draw the cup, the bottle, and you kind of forget that there's the space in between that actually defines everything else. And I thought, oh, the ocean is like a huge negative space for humankind, because our senses, our land senses, we carry the ocean within us, but we've kind of left it behind. And we're structured by our verticality, the fact that we divide things bilaterally, that we stand up, that we think in up and down, that we breathe air, that we perceive the world with light. And the ocean is sort of the opposite in that a lot of ways. It's mostly dark. The sense of up and down is very different when you have buoyancy. There's this huge pressure that very quickly exerts itself. And so I thought there must be all of these sensorial differences that make it almost a negative space for us. So how do we explore it? So I like these kinds of paradoxical shifts. And so for me, that was one. And then after a certain amount of time getting to know each other, we were supposed to come up with some weird ideas. And so, you know, we had like 15 minutes and a bunch of Post-its. And so I filled lots of ideas about the negative space and the network and all that. And then literally in the last 15 seconds or 10 seconds, it was like, does the ocean have memory? And if so, what form does it take? And that was my last Post-it. And we put it up on the wall, and it was, you know, people started looking, and someone else was like, well, I'd like to think about that with you. And I think, so what's specific about that connection, ocean and memory, is that we think of the ocean, so we think of the world through language, and we create kind of perceptual categories, and then we forget that there are categories, they're not the worlds. And so when we think of the natural world, we think the natural world is a place of laws and not of affect, not of intelligence, not of emotion, and certainly not, generally speaking, of consciousness. When we think of memory, we first think about our intimate memories, the fact that of what we remember about yesterday, about our parents, about our the madeleine that we ate at breakfast. Those of us who, well, I don't eat madeleines, but some people did. But it's something that's profoundly human and that's connected to our sense of self. And so when you bring together ocean and memory, you create this kind of weird dissonance that's really meaningful. It like explodes the space of meaning of the two terms. And you start thinking about, well, so what ocean are we talking about? What kind of memories are we talking about? What is a memory process? What would it look like if the ocean as a body of water. Remember, what's that process like? It starts to create this kind of feedback. And then when you're doing that from a lot of different disciplines, it can be about the physical ocean. It can be a deeply scientific question about microbial networks, or it can be a poetic one about the information the waves carry. You know, it can be all of those things. And what it does is it displaces, normally we care for things that are close to us, that we understand. And there's this kind of very simplistic sort of gradient. The closer something is to us, the more we care about it. Typically in our culture, it's like our family or our spouse or our children. And then as you go back, you kind of care less and less and less. Sometimes you care a lot about things that are far away, but generally speaking, we don't really care about microbes very much, or at least not positively. You know, we tend to attribute care to distance. And so if all of a sudden something that's very far, you give it attributes that are actually very intimate, something happens. So we're curious about that, the intellectual journey, the new questions that arise, and also kind of in a world where we are literally falling off a cliff, how do we reverse 500 years at least of kind of uncaring and make that into a space of caring? So there's a really deep, you know, if we want to survive, we need to start to care for each other and for the planet. So I think that's something that we'd like to be part of that.
Thank you. And you inspired somebody to write their connection to ocean memory. So this person wrote, "I'm a creative writer, hybrid writer, who grew up near the ocean, but have a hard time sometimes with accessing memory, at least in a linear way. Also interested in collaborating with scientists and other disciplines. I teach at UW-Bothell." I know we have a few folks on here who are interested in collaborating across differences. That's why they are here. So I'm wondering if either of you have any advice to give them.
I'm sure you all have a lot of advice to give us. Like, how do we, how do we do this thing? You know, I mean, I think, I mean, yeah, there are moments in which we have understanding that we can share, but I think the richest exchange that's possible is actually bringing our points of view to each other and being able to hear. So maybe that's advice, like start with that. But I would love, you know, if any of you want to continue this discussion offline later, you know, we'll put our emails in the chat and we can continue in a bi-directional way. But it's hard to give advice, especially when we don't, you know, it depends so much about what each of you want to do. You know, what drives you to want to work with other people? How do you want to share? What are your goals in sharing? You know,
I think one of the things we benefit from is that we have an organizing principle, if you will, which is ocean memory. We have a concept that we're dealing with, and we're coming at it from many, many different directions, but we're constantly keeping that as our focus. And if you have a focus that's broad enough and provocative enough, then I think the best thing you can do is listen to each other. If you have a narrower focus, a more specific goal or outcome, you still need to listen to each other, but bring in some other voices. Because you may predestine the outcome given your small number of voices. So you want to expand the viewpoints that come into play. And one of the things that has been that it's been important to me personally, but also to realize for the citizenry of the country, if you will, is that we seem to have lost a sense of reverence for our environment. At least the Western world has. And if you can connect to the environment by something that's very intimate and human, like memory, then maybe you can bring a greater reverence to the environment. And so there is a part of me that is hoping that ocean memory will help people to connect to the ocean and realize that we need to take care of the ocean. We need to take care about what we do to it, because we're doing a lot to it that's not good. And if I may, can I address one of the questions that's in the chat about the origin of the coronavirus in the ocean, because it's an example here. And first of all, the coronavirus itself did not originate from the ocean. Its ancient lineage is from the ocean. It came from bats or wherever it came from recently. But that's the point of the Siam article, which is that what we thought was horrifying and unusual, that this virus potentially jumped from a bat to human beings, is normal in the ocean. The lineage of this coronavirus that goes way, way back in time, there are papers written about how it jumped from one invertebrate to the next in the ocean over evolutionary time. And it should not be surprising to us. And when we degrade our environment, we can expect more jumping of viruses. So we need to be prepared. This is how to answer the question the person wrote about is, why does it matter to know that the lineage of coronavirus comes from the ocean? Well, if we explore that more fully, we come to realize that this is a part of biology, how viruses and their hosts work together, and not be surprised and be prepared. Imagine if we had been better prepared.
Yeah, that would be nice. We have another question. I think we have a little more time, so I'll ask it. How do you balance what your original vision might have been in incorporating newer ideas and voices? So I guess the expectation of what you thought would happen, but knowing that you've talked multiple times about needing to incorporate newer voices, but how do you balance that?
So maybe I'll jump in first this time, Jody. So I think there's a difference between having a vision and needing to go to the destination that the vision described. And part of moving forward in the world with a certain amount of attention is that you're ready kind of for the fact that at any point you might go sideways, but continue moving. And so, you know, in April, we had to decide to suspend our in-person meeting in Lewes, Delaware, where we were supposed to have our first real workshop on cognition and genomics. And we had to invent, as everybody did, what it might look like to have a virtual workshop. And, you know, it was like, well, let's do it. And I think we all did it, you know? So I think as a culture or as a species, we're actually very flexible. We're very able to pivot, and it teaches us a lot. I think everybody was surprised at the kinds of things we could start doing without, and at the speed at which parts of the environment started bouncing back. And so we could say, well, darn it, we didn't get to do our in-person workshop. But in fact, what we're learning by continuing to think and process and pay attention and evolve with the situation is more valuable in a sense than where we thought we were going to go. And so that's the case with the new voices that come to the table, is because they enrich the possible directions that we might go in. And so there's no regrets, you know, like it's not like, oh, well, I can't reach my destination anymore. The destination's totally transformed. You know, it's like, it's constantly transforming. And it's in that process of transformation that we start to understand and see the capabilities that we have collectively. So it's almost like the opposite. There is no, there's an intention to move, but there is no destination in that sense. I think that's the particularity of ocean memory. It's not narrow, but it's not nothing. It's a kind of sharp metaphor that allows us to meet across perspectives on a very specific focus. So it's like both very broad and very precise. And I think there are a lot of keys like that, and I think the question is just allowing ourselves to hear them when we see them, you know, or when we think of them, or when we dream them, or not to be afraid and go like, well, you know, it could have been that the 15 scientists in the room, when I said, does the ocean have memory, would say, of course not, Daniel, what are you talking about? But they didn't.
No, we jumped off our seats and said, that's it. I'd like to just comment that a lot of what I've thought about in the past as a scientist has been success versus failure. We're sort of taught to think about success versus failure. This experiment failed. We achieved this goal and we're successful with this grant. And success is defined as meeting the expectation. So I think it'd be useful if we redefine failure and define it as welcoming the unexpected and learning from the unexpected. Take it out of its negative black and white space there of success and failure, but realize that failure is just discovering the unexpected, meeting it full head on and learning from it, and learning more from it than achieving the expected. So in terms of how do we adjust our vision going along the way? Well, we're welcoming the unexpected at every turn and learning from it.
Hear, hear. That sounds great to me. Well, we are at the bottom of the hour here. I want to thank you both so much for joining us today. If you would like to share any contact information, please do so in the chat, or I can share it with folks afterwards. We want to thank everyone else for joining us today, our monthly series. We will have more for you in the new year. Please stay up to date on all of our events on our website. And thank you so much. Have a wonderful rest of your day, everybody.
Thank you, Constance. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Thanks, Constance.